And we're live, and we've got a very, very special show for you today. Today, we've got the Open Peace podcast, who are a collective from the Middle East, from the Holy Land, from a variety of places, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But they do incredible work and bridging the divide between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Samaritans, Christians. And I've been on their podcast, and it was appropriate to bring them onto our podcast so they can share the incredible work that they do and discuss peacemaking. What I'd like to do, though, before jumping into that is today someone I know was stabbed at Speaker's Corner in an Islamic terror attack. So I'd just like to open the show by saying that we're praying for her recovery, her speedy recovery, and hopefully the perpetrator will be arrested and brought to justice. And on that more sober note, I'll open the floor up. So whoever wants to jump in, maybe Abood, maybe you go first because you've been on the show before. Maybe some of the audience are familiar with you already. So just introduce yourself and maybe a very, very quick introduction to the Open Peace podcast.
Sure. Thank you for having us, Joseph. Definitely had a pleasure last time on your having you and also coming on your podcast and talking about the Samaritan community. My name is Abood Cohen. My Arabic name is also like Abdallah, Ovadia. Cause I have two names because I lived and grew up with the Samaritan community. So some of the viewers might already have a little bit of knowledge about the Samaritan community. So I really started this podcast with Jared, Amir, and our friend Kane about 7-8 months ago. And then Anna also joined us about 2 months ago. And we really have a lot of exciting new projects on the way. So, Jared, do you want to talk about the podcast and a little bit about our
Yeah, I love talking about the podcast. It's
Goals
like
and
my
missions.
favorite thing right now in my life. But first, I want to mention I just realized Am Yisrael Live that I see right there. That's genius.
Oh,
Like it clicked in my head as I was looking at
That's-
Abood while he speak, and I see Am
That's pretty
Yisrael.
creative.
That's great, but I just had to get that out of the way because I really like that. I like cheesy stuff. Well, Abood kind of covered most of it. Like, well, we just had the idea of doing something together on the internet, and eventually, we originally had the idea of doing an app where, people would submit their own peace plans and discuss amongst themselves, but we have no idea how to do that. So we thought, well, what's a better way to get started and just getting people to talk to one another other than a podcast, essentially a talk show. And that's kind of just all we really want to do. Well, I'm done. Someone else can speak now.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll go ahead, Jared. Unless Anna, do you want to hop in there before?
I can just go ahead and say how I found you guys. So I grew up in modern Orthodox religious Zionist community, and probably like a lot of listeners here, very pro-Israel kind of environment. And I really had this phase like when I got older where I wanted to understand Palestinians instead of just, hearing about them from Israelis or from pro-Israel people, and to really hear their perspective. So I actually went to Nablus for 3 weeks, and my family was very angry. But that's when I met Abood, and I learned a lot of things that I didn't expect about how similar our two peoples are, and how many things maybe when you're in a bubble and you're only talking to other people who agree with you, you're just not gonna miss certain information. And I think, one of the reasons I love this podcast is because it's all about kind of bridging those two information bubbles and really seeing each other's humanity.
That's great, and it's been fantastic having you join the team, Anna. I think you bring a lot to the table in terms of the podcast. It's fantastic to have you with us, and I just want to say thank you, Joseph, for giving us the opportunity to come on your fantastic podcast and share what we're doing with the Open Peace podcast. We really are trying to bridge that gap and trying to open up dialogue and communication between Israelis and Palestinians and other peoples that are stuck in conflict as well. We feel that it's best to start at a grassroots level because, you know, we've kind of tried before in the past to jump to peace plans, and there's been many things proposed in the past, Oslo and Ehud Barak's plan and Olmert's plan and Trump's plan. And I think we're putting the cart ahead of the horse. We need to start at a grassroots level, get people talking, understand each other's issues, understand why people are hurting, because there's actually pain on both sides, on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, and it needs to be confronted and it needs to be reconciled with, because there are things that have happened on both sides which are terrible, and you know, most normal sane people would want those things to stop and for there to be a better future. And for that to happen, you know, people like yourself, Joseph, people like Adar in the Sulha community, they're really doing their best to put out a better voice, a voice of unity out there. And that's really what we're about. So if you haven't heard of us before, please do come and check out our channel. Don't forget to subscribe. We love people engaging with our content. We try and get back to all the comments. And yeah, that's pretty much us and what we do.
Yeah.
And I'm Amir, by the way. Yeah, half British, half Israeli, however you want to see that. I've lived in Israel and in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what our podcast is trying to do also is that we you know, it's like in the last few years when you talk about peace, a lot of people, they think it's a kind of a fluffy notion. It's not realistic. It's really out there. It might happen, but not in the next 100,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
And we're here to kind of show people even practical evidence that it's closer than many people might think. And there might be some practical steps that make us live more peacefully, really, among others, because that's what we have to do. Otherwise, it's not going to get any better. That's the thing.
I'm going to jump in and ask you, because I've been involved in peace work for a while, and I know what I think the biggest barrier to peace between Israelis and Palestinians and broader Jews and Muslims, and that I think Abu Samaritans are quite fortunate that they have good relations with both communities, but certainly between Jews and Muslims, our relations are at one of the lowest they've been. And I really want to know what each of you feel is the biggest obstacle to peace.
Sure.
Should I go first? I mean, I'm closest to him on the screen. At least it's what it looks like.
Sure.
Go for it.
All right. Well, honestly, right now, I think the biggest obstacle to at least like the first level of peace, which is just peace in the streets between individuals, is that we get wrapped up so much in our national narratives, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian, where when one person talks about the suffering they've had because of the conflict, then the other side needs to counter with their own suffering, and we act as if like one has to supersede the other. You know, there was something I said very early on in our show, which is that on our show we don't play suffering as currency. Suffering is suffering, pain is pain, and we need to recognize that both as Israelis and Palestinians. You know, Israelis need to recognize that like the pain and suffering Palestinians are having is valid, and Palestinians need to understand that like our pain and suffering is valid. Because if we keep denying that, we're not really going to get anywhere.
Right.
Very well put.
All right. I'd also like to put a few points. I think there's definitely more than a few obstacles, but what comes to my mind right now is probably the people who would condemn people who speak about peace, or like, for example, I'll tell you something. Like, I have an example when we had Rudy Rochman on. We basically did this kind of a cleanup. What was it called, guys? Cleaning the hate.
Cleaning hate.
Yeah. So we had this like picture that Rudy posted that basically included me as a Samaritan, him as Israeli, and then a Palestinian. But we had to blur the Palestinian face, and that kind of made me think, like, but what's the point? We're trying to show people that we're trying to live peacefully, but like when you blur someone's face, and I know, of course, that why, but you see, they have to be able, like the Palestinians have to be able to speak for themselves. And I think when they're condemned for opening up, I think that's a big obstacle that we have to face one way or another. We have to find ways so that people can feel much safer to talk about what they feel realistically about the other side. So,
yeah. Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. For me, I think the biggest gap thing is the information gap. From what I saw, I grew up in pretty much as pro-Israel of a community as it gets. And going to Nablus, I just was shocked by the misconceptions that I had and the misconceptions that they had. So, for example, the word Zionist, like for me, growing up in the Jewish community, I feel like you have to be like, if you say you're not a Zionist in the Jewish community, it's like you must be crazy, like you must be the most horrible person, or like a self-hating Jew or something like that. But in the Palestinian community, it's like exactly the opposite. For them, they always were saying, like constantly I heard, we have nothing against Jewish people, but all Zionism is evil, right? And to even suggest that Zionism is not always bad is like crazy for them, like crazy. And even some of the most moderate Palestinians kind of had this view. And it's because we define the word differently. It's not because the moderate Zionist Israelis are so crazy, or the moderate anti-Zionist Palestinians are so crazy. Neither of those groups are actually, when you sit down and talk to them, they're actually really kind, respectful, decent human beings. I've spoken to both those kinds of people, but they have this gap about how they see that specific word, that boom, if you don't like that word, you're evil. Or if you do like that word, you're evil. And I think it's just this huge information gap. Like we're both missing a lot of information. For me, I grew up hearing like the occupation is like a total lie and people are just making that up because they're anti-Semitic. And then I actually learned about the conflict, and I learned that, oh, there's a reason, like there is Israeli control over an area of Palestinians, and the Palestinians don't get citizenship. Whatever you want to call it, but there's reason to have a problem for that. It's not so crazy for people to be frustrated with that. And for me, growing up in the pro-Israel community, I felt like that wasn't taught to me. It was just, these people are terrorists and they're evil. And on the flip side, when I spent time in Nablus, and I also spent some time in Egypt, they're taught that, and this is something that everybody believes, is the Jews lived wonderfully in Muslim countries, and it was like all happy and peaceful, and there was no problem. And my family is from Iraq and Iran, and I have like living testament that that's not true. I've heard the stories, but I've genuinely met like the kindest human beings who really believe that in their hearts. They really believe that, Jewish people never had any problems in a Muslim country, and they just went to Israel because they wanted to the Zionists wanted to destroy Palestinian lives or be colonialists. So it's not that. And when you realize that we're operating with different sets of information, you start to realize like the individual people, they're not bad. The reason we disagree is because we're not getting the same facts, And so that for me is the biggest obstacle for peace. And I think that comes down to the language barrier, and that comes down to the fact that we have such different media. And I think that's why our podcast is so good, is because we're trying to really bridge that information gap and talk and learn what facts are we missing on both sides.
Yeah, you're right. It's not only about like not getting the same facts. Sometimes you might get the same facts but interpret them in a different way. But yeah, you're right.
For sure, dude. For sure, and you're 100% right, Anna. That's definitely a huge issue that we have over here. But Joseph, I would just like to say that's a fantastic question to start off with. And for me, I'm just going to put it very, very simply for our viewers. We have a term in Hebrew, in Judaism, called sinat chinam. I think the best translation for it is like baseless hate. So I think that's the biggest obstacle that we're actually having, not just in the Middle East, but online and all over. And I think if we did the opposite of that, which is ahavat chinam, which is free love, which is not meant in a hippy dippy way of like, 1960s Woodstock, but it just means that, when you approach anything in your life or somebody who's different to you, approach that person with love instead of a baseless hate, which unfortunately is something that both populations have an issue with. On the Palestinian side, it's obviously an issue, and the education is lacking in some in some of the historical sense. A lot of information is missed out. And on the Israeli side, there is a lot of hate there because of some of the things that have happened, and there's racism there. And these are the things that need to be addressed to get the Holy Land functioning peacefully in a good way. You need to holistically heal from the bottom and address the issues that we have there. If education is an issue, you can address that. You can pump money into education. You can build schools. You can work on universities. You can get better curriculums together. So there's definitely a lot of hope there. I just have a little comment here, Joseph. Someone's put Israel is peaceful. Now, in general, Israel is peaceful, right? And things are generally peaceful here. But unfortunately, for people who have lived here for the last 20 years, let's say, Israel is peaceful, but then sporadically, it's very, very not peaceful. 2006, 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, earlier this year. These were all wars that happened between Israelis and Palestinians, and also Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, that have cost many, many, many people's lives, have impacted many, many families and friends of mine and people on the Palestinian side as well. And that's why we're doing this podcast, because we don't want to see a repeat cycle of that over the next 20 years. We want to tackle the issues at hand. And for that, we need your support, guys, and we need people like Joseph to continue their quest. And we need people like Adar. If you don't know Adar in the Sulha community, you should definitely check those guys out as well, doing amazing work out here in the Holy Land.
So I'd just like to jump in, because one of the things that I found really interesting in all of your answers, the biggest barrier, I believe, to peace wasn't mentioned by any of you, and the conflict was painted in very nationalist terms and very human terms, so the relationships between people. But for the many years I've been involved in the conflict, I've come to realize, I think the reason this conflict has been so hard to overcome is one simple word: religion. And it wasn't touched on by anyone in your answers, which I found really interesting.
I actually had it in my mind at the beginning, Joseph,
because religion's a part of it, but when it comes to people fighting, it's always about people issues. I mean, religion can be part of it, yes, but it's not like the main idea. The main idea behind the conflict is not the destruction of Islam or the destruction of Judaism. It's more of it's two competing nationalisms.
I disagree. It is nationalism, but it's Al-Quds, it's Yerushalayim, it's Hawaii.
So I'll tell you.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I used to think exactly like you. And even a few weeks ago, I think on our podcast, I think one of the first podcasts I was on, I said, I think that at the end of the day, this conflict would be solved if it wasn't for religion. And I still think that might be true. But I've talked to enough Palestinian Christians and Palestinian atheists and Jewish atheists. And I think that they're both big obstacles. Like, I don't think either one can be discounted, because we have met for sure, Palestinian Christians who are just as militant as maybe, as any Muslim you might see, right? Who are just as pro-Palestine and just as anti-Israel. And
nice reference.
So I don't know if my original hypothesis is like totally fair.
So I hear that, but for the Christians, it's also religious. So the reason Christians are in Jerusalem, in the Judea, Samaria, Palestine, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, is for religious reasons. In the most part, I mean, there are many that have. The reason they've stayed is religion. The reason that they define themselves as Christian is for religious reasons. And I think the broader, while Christians are definitely part of the conflict, and I agree they can be just as militant as can the Marxists and the many different Palestinian subcultures and subcommunities under the Palestinian national identity. I think there's no escaping that the majority of the population are Muslim. And I think when you look at on the Jewish side or on the Israeli side, the majority are Jewish. And the majority are believers. They're not atheists. The majority of Israelis may not be Haredi, but they're not atheists. It's not America. In almost every poll I've seen, the majority believe in God. Jerusalem is important to them. And Jerusalem was important in 1948. I mean, you only need to look at how the resources were allocated in the conflict. Jerusalem was vital to both communities, to the Jordanians, to the Palestinians, to the Israelis. And so, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Anna, and I do think it's more than just a Jewish Muslim thing, but I do think that the reason there's so much external focus on this conflict, which is the biggest, but the reason the Palestinians can't make peace with the Israelis, even if they wanted to, historically has been because of external pressure from the broader Arab and Muslim world. You've got Christian evangelicals in America that are looking at the conflict. The entire world is looking at this conflict because of religion. And I think for me, it's the biggest barrier. And I don't know how you
actually. Like Joseph, like just one thing. I think, guys, if you remember, what was it? I think I see here like episode number 6 on our channel was religion versus atheism. Can they live together? And we kind of touched on the subject. Yeah. But I grew up in Palestinian schools, and I saw what they taught. Like first grade and second grade, I learned Islamic religion. And then from 3rd grade until like 7th grade, I didn't have to, because I grew up in I learned in a Samaritan school, which taught Palestinian curriculum without the Islamic subjects. But then all the grades after that, I was in the class and saw what they taught in the Islamic class, which I didn't take, but I was still in the class and saw what they taught. And so I don't know exactly if it's 100% on religion. There's definitely a few things. Like I know a lot of like a big number of Palestinians who are in the university, for example, who are atheists, but they were very pro-Palestinian, even maybe more than religious Palestinians. But it's definitely it's, you can say, the misuse of religion also, it makes it even worse. Because there is something called the people of the book. If you want to go a little bit deep, there is something called the people of the book. And actually, the people of the book concept kind of saved the Samaritans when they lived with the Palestinians. Because there's a rabbi called Chaim Gagin who gave the Samaritans this famous letter that told the Muslims around there that, hey, guys, these are like Bnei Israel. So you kind of leave them alone. They're the people of the book. And that definitely helped us. But even the people of the book concept, I don't think it kind of helped a lot, if you know what I mean. There are some things that might cause some racism between from Muslims towards Jewish people. Yeah, either misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, personally, Joseph, I think religion plays a factor in what's going on here. And what you were talking about, of course, Jerusalem, El-Quds, Arabai, the Temple Mount, it's so important. All the religious sites in the old city, it's all very, very important to millions of believers. Sorry, not thousands, millions and millions of believers worldwide. But I think that religion's only a factor in it. There's so much more to this. And why I was saying baseless hate is one of the main things that we need to fight against here, is because I see it every day, Joseph. You can see it in the way that people use language, will talk about other people. You see it every day on social media. You see the amount of hate. So, you know, I'm looking, as somebody who's agnostic, I'm looking at people that are religious and saying, okay, guys, you know, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, as far as I know, a lot of the laws are very similar, a lot of the main ones, you know, and it doesn't seem that anyone around here is following any of these things. So first of all, clean up your act before we jump on to Jerusalem and how we're going to do this, and how we have to deal with the root issues, which are the hate. Like Aboud said, in the Palestinian school systems, I want to get this straight to people so they understand. In Gaza, there are textbooks which teach physics by stone throwing at IDF soldiers. Okay, that is how they're teaching their kids physics. So if you don't address those issues, how are we going to get to a nice, peaceful Jerusalem and no more wars and a good life? You have to tackle the root issues, and the root issues are hate, racism, and another one of the huge issues is the misinformation and the not understanding of each other's history. If you talk to educated people on both sides, Israeli and Palestinian, people that have gone to university, people that have dedicated their life to studying the region, studying the languages, they understand that both peoples have a long history in the land. You can't deny that.
Yeah.
You can't
Do you think
wipe it
both
out.
sides? Do you think that's a common position on both sides of the conflict?
With highly educated people, yeah. Yeah, they know what's going on. If you take somebody on the Israeli side who doesn't know anything and somebody on the Palestinian side who doesn't know anything, the automatic might be hate because they don't understand.
So my understanding is slightly different. My experience has been that Anna would be considered kosher and I would be considered haram, in the sense that my skin is too white and I've got Ashkenazi DNA, which is the wrong DNA to have amongst many people who look to say who's got a right to live in the land. And so my understanding, or the impression I've had from the years of dialogue I've had, is that some Jews are accepted and many Jews are rejected. And Amir, you were quite not clever, but you described yourself as Israeli and British. So maybe they'd accept you. Maybe I think I remember what you said. Your background was, and I think you'd be fine. But certainly, from my perspective, there are some Jews that are seen as many Israelis are seen as European colonizers that have no place in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so time to move on.
And on the other side, on our side, just like to finish. And on our side, there are many, and I'm going to get flack now in the comments for saying this, but there are many who say that Arabs have no place in the region either because Arabs are from Arabia, ignoring the fact that many Palestinians have DNA that's actually Jewish. And so I don't know how you square that circle, but I think it's true on both sides. And
yeah, didn't like a lot of people, especially in Nablus, because they're so close to Samaritans, they literally are descended from the ancient Israelites, because a lot of Samaritans converted to Islam, right?
Yeah. The last family that converted is known as, like, the name of it is Maslamani. And just like 2 days ago, I learned what does Maslamani mean, the family Maslamani name. Apparently, when they were the most recent who converted from Samaritanism to Islam, and the people used to call them, oh, Samaritan, you know, like, and then what was the reply? Oh, no, Muslimani. So that's why they called them Muslimani, the family of Muslimani. But it's true. A lot of people in Nablus, actually, Nablus was about like 90% Samaritan at some point. There's a lot of evidence to show that.
Yeah.
Today, it's more like 99.9% Muslims. And even we had Christian population, but it's getting lower. They're kind of leaving. But yeah.
And someone actually called that out in the chat there. They spoke in the comments thing on YouTube, saying that the Christian population in general in Palestinian areas is in decline. When we were saying that there were many Palestinians that were Christian, there are a few people that objected to that.
There is. I mean, I have a good friend who said to me that, like, that lives in Nablus, is a Christian. So he said, There it is. I told him, "Are you leaving?" He said, "No, never." You know, he's one of those people who just wants to stay here because his family staying loyal to the place. But there are some people who are leaving. So
Yeah.
Also, sorry.
No, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, just to respond to Joseph's point about like that I think the idea that about the European colonizer thing, it's something that really frustrates me, and I've heard that too, and it drives me nuts. One thing that's important to note is like also a lot of Palestinians and Arabs I've talked to even think that Sephardi Jews or Middle Eastern Jews should all go back to where they came from, which like confuses me. Not everyone thinks that, right? Like if you talk to, like we said, like educated, moderate Palestinians, they kind of realize that we're here and we're not leaving. But there is that mentality among the more extremist groups, and they, you know, so it doesn't. They don't think that. Yeah, so that's a problem.
You know, I had a Hamas extremist. I have a friend who used to be a Hamas extremist, really, and he completely changed, almost to kind of like I wouldn't say pro-Israeli. He does love Israel. He even works in Israel now. But he told me how he changed completely. He used to love Hamas songs and used to chant them, and you know, and it's just incredible to see how he kind of completely changed. And I think what broke his barrier was just opening up more and the willingness to, you know truth for yourself and not only accept hearsay, because I think hearsay is a big problem here, and the media and all that things. Today we have access. You can agree with me, by the way, Joseph, and everyone, that 20 years ago our situation with the violence in this region was just much worse. These days we do see a few things here and there, but despite the media covering almost as like twice as much as what 20 years ago would have been, because we have social media today, but we're not seeing violence as much as 20 years ago. And I think that's because of maybe the internet. People are opening up, people are seeing some truth. Maybe peace is easier these days because of technology, you know.
So maybe I'm more of a cynic.
That is a good point, because it is so much easier for you to just talk with somebody on the other side of the planet. True. Let alone like somebody who lives 5 kilometers from you, you know? Like, I mean,
I was just gonna, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that like me as an Israeli, I could go on the Facebook right now, find an Iranian, like just go find Iranians and just start smashing like add friend until somebody like takes it, and I could just talk with them on Messenger. Like Iran, our countries hate each other, and yet there's still people out there who just refuse to take advantage of that.
And so I'd agree in part. I do think technology makes it easier to make connections like never before. I mean, this panel is a great example. I'm living in the UK. We've got a Samaritan. We've got who is just outside Nablus or inside Nablus. I'm not even sure how it relates where you
can say that. Yeah, like 5 minutes away. Yeah.
But I think the real reason that violence isn't as strong as it has been historically is because Israel has continuously and consistently become stronger and stronger and more dominant. And if you were speaking from a Palestinian perspective, you probably would be looking at the situation as the years progress more and more desperately as your national aspirations kind of evaporate in front of you. And so I think technology helps people at a grassroots level connect, but it also inflames. And so I can speak much more confidently about the UK than I can on Israel compared to the panel, because you guys are all there, I'm here. But in the last flare-up of violence, we had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets protesting against Israel, all be organized on social media. We had car convoys driving through my neighborhood with people declaring they were going to rape my wife and daughter, or the Jewish women and Jewish girls, on megaphones, which they'd organized over social media, filmed for TikTok. And so social media also, or technology, can also really polarize communities as well. So it really depends.
You're behind the screen anyway. And you're
exactly in the way the algorithms work. I know as a content creator, if I put out a video that's peacemaking, so let's say one of the things we did, we handed out dates for Ramadan. For people to break the fast and not to eat during Ramadan. That would be a bit cruel. But we handed out dates for Ramadan from British Jews, Jewish Zionists, as an extension of friendship. And the video bombed. The Muslims were delighted. They were like, "This is so kind. Thank you. I hope we can have peace." But nobody watched the video because it's not interesting. If I put out a video of me, I put out a video of someone I know getting stabbed today, which was horrendous. In fact, it's a blessing that I wasn't stabbed today, because there's a place in the UK called Speaker's Corner. And this actually, it speaks exactly to the problem we're talking about here. Speaker's Corner used to be a place where Jews, Muslims, communists, whoever would go and talk about their different ideologies. It was freedom of speech, and it was an incredibly friendly place. Every time I went there, Muslims would come up and give me a hug and tell me I was their brother. Christians would do the same. And it was a very nice place. And what happened was, about 7 or 8 years ago, people started filming the interactions, and they became increasingly hostile, myself included, because the ego becomes involved. So whereas I would historically be very, very complimentary of Islam and very open about maybe the flaws within my own faith, the minute you put a camera on me and someone's attacking Judaism, I'm going to throw up the defenses and I'm going to go on the attack as well. And it just turns into
self-bias anyway.
Yeah, ego-driven debate, and that was all driven by technology. So there was a woman there today. She's a Christian preacher. She's very, very critical of Islam. Many would say provocative. And she was stabbed, all for social media. And so I think technology can be incredibly powerful. And the video I put out today documenting the woman being stabbed, I'm sure will get lots of shares. If I had a video of a Muslim coming up to a Jew and giving them a box of chocolates, nobody would watch it. People want negative news. People click negative news. People share negative news.
And that's why, Joseph, you'd see a lot of like both Israelis and Palestinians who literally think that the other side just wants to kill the other side. Like they really think that everyone on the other side wants to kill us, and that's completely not true, you know.
And I want to address something else as well that you're talking about, Joseph, here, which is the struggle we have to get good content out there. Like you said, the dates at Ramadan, it's not going to work. A stabbing in the park, everybody. So actually, we also have to look at ourselves and what we're viewing and what we're deciding to put into our lives, because, you know, with all due respect, the amount of violence that is shown on the news, on the TV, on the internet, it's actually horrific. Like, there was 2 times this year on the Israeli news where I've been actually shocked that they're showing the images that they're showing. So one time was after a plane crash where actually people from my kibbutz, a pilot died and a trainee, and they were showing the wreckage of the plane, like, you know, and I just thought, this is horrific. Why show this? Like, just show something else. Don't show the wreckage. And then another one was, there was a cable car disaster where a family died in Italy, and they showed like the image of the accident happening, and there was a kid who survived that. Imagine that kid then growing up and seeing these images that were broadcasted to the whole world. So I really do think we need to think about what type of content we're viewing and where we're getting our information. We find it very hard as a podcast that is talking about supposedly controversial things. We don't really talk about controversial things, but it's deemed controversial. We can't advertise. We can't market properly. We can't get our voice out there. If we were a football podcast or a cat podcast or selling some shoes podcast, we could get ads out there. We could do. So we really, what I'm trying to say is to our viewers out there, we really do need your support to get behind what we're doing. We've got big plans, you know, and get behind Joseph's movement, because what he really does is uniting and building bridges. I've seen so many of your debates with our Muslim cousins and our Christian friends, and it's wonderful to see interfaith dialogue. As somebody who's agnostic, to see Jews, Christians, Muslims sitting down at a table, discussing scriptures, addressing the problems in each one's faith, maybe, and then pushing back on it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Sharing food, good tahini.
Yeah.
God damn it.
Where can we get some good tahini from? Does anyone on the panel know?
Oh,
They say there's a brand called Harbracha Tahini.
Oh yeah.
But where can we find
I hate you so much. I hate you
it's in a lot of
much.
Israeli stores, by the way.
Jews and Muslims have a reputation of being like hagglers and businessmen and really going over there. Samaritans just trump both of us. Like, you guys are on a different level.
Like the brand of the Samaritan thing is pretty strong.
Just getting free advertising for your factory, and I'm just always gonna be mad about it.
Well, they're sponsoring our podcast, so. But there's some like tahini aside, although tahini inside always has to be inside. Tahini aside, we have to. I have to address also something very important, Jared, if you allow me. So, studying in the University of An-Najah, I've noticed one incredible, very huge factor, I think, in shaping how the Palestinians. Or anyone that goes to university, even from both sides, how it shapes their identity and it shapes their kind of their view in the conflict. Tahini is the solution. Yes, it is. So, and what I mean is there's this class called Palestinian Studies. This is just one example that I like to use sometimes. Palestinian Studies, and it kind of teaches the students. This is a mandatory class that every student, university student, has to take, and it's a mandatory class, and they teach you about Palestinian history, and it slowly kind of goes into Zionism a little bit. So they teach you things about Zionism. Now remember, whether you believe in what is written in that book that you have to study, whether you believe in it or not, you're going to have to answer based on the book that they provided you. And one of the things that they teach, I remember, is that the Holocaust was exaggerated. And it kind of was shocking for me because, as a Samaritan, I also grew up believing that our Jewish brothers suffered a lot in 1948 and in the World War II. And suddenly I see it and I was shocked. And then in the test, I think there was this question about it. And I don't want to fail in the class. So, so I had to kind of give that answer. But you see, I hope you see why it's a problem,
Big problem.
Yeah.
Big problem, Abood. Huge problem. And this is what I was saying about education. Someone put in a message, what we need is not education, but empathy. I agree we need more empathy in the Middle East, but it's also education. It's key. Without it, we're going nowhere. Without improving our education system, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side, we're not getting anywhere. And stuff like that, Abood, do you know what? Send them over to Poland. Send them, go for yourself. Go and visit some of the places and go see for yourself what happened.
They also talked about the Torah, by the way, the Torah being altered to.
Yeah.
Tarif al-Nas, is that right? The two different types of corruption.
Tahrif, yeah.
Yeah.
Tahrif, alteration.
Abood, our partner, whose name I still am not sure if we can say on the show. One of the first conversations I had with him was him just telling me about what his family went through during 48, the Nakba, and me just telling him what my family went through in Europe. It was just so shortly after meeting him, we just had this big bonding moment of talking about what our grandparents and their families went through during that very difficult period. And, there was no denying of pain. There was no anger, no accusations of lies. There was no one-upsmanship, just two people talking about their own societal trauma. And it was a beautiful moment, and it honestly sucks that we weren't doing the podcast when we had that conversation. But honestly, I think we need more of that, because education isn't also just in the classroom. Education is also out in the streets. It's online. It's just when people talk. And
people
we need to change the textbooks, obviously, but just the fact that like we're putting this information out there,
And
like that in of itself is going the extra mile.
yeah, and it's crazy because you talk about, and it's shocking and horrible to hear that the Holocaust is exaggerated. And at the same time, I know that in my community, I was taught that the Nakba wasn't a thing. Like, it was exaggerated and everybody left willingly, and, these things that, or people try to put, I don't think most people are like genuinely trying to lie, but they're just trying to twist the story so much that it fits their narrative of like good and evil. And the reality is that like we're all human beings, and yeah, like that really bad things happen to both of these groups of people.
And every nation, I think, on Earth would focus on the good things. No, I'm just saying, I think every nation would like try to sprinkle, good things on their history and kind of avoid the bad things that they did. But yeah, I see your point. And
it is one of the pushbacks you may experience because, with the exception of the Mufti and actually what happened to many of the German generals post World War II, or the officers that came over and fought in the 48 war, but ignoring that, most Palestinians weren't responsible for the Holocaust.
No, not at all.
And when you talk about the 1948 war, what you're saying is that Israelis are responsible for inflicting a trauma on the Palestinians. I'm more to the right, I think, than most people on the panel. And I would push back and say there were traumas on both sides. And you could maybe describe them both as a catastrophe, but you couldn't describe just one of them, because the massacres, while there were very few massacres on both sides, they happened on both sides. The Etzion block, the convoys, there were
Sure.
And so I guess the only reason I'm saying that is it's very easy it's much easier for a Palestinian to accept that people thousands of miles away slaughtered a community in Europe, a Jewish community, than it is for Israelis to agree with narratives which maybe they don't agree with and are very, very critical and put huge questions on their legitimacy as a nation. So I think that's maybe one of the difficulties with discussing those two traumas. There isn't an equivalency. One was the genocide of 6 million people. The other was a civilian civil war in which people died on both sides. And like most conflicts, there was one winner and one loser, and the Palestinians or the Arabs, despite initiating the conflict, were the losers of that conflict. So maybe that makes that conversation a little more challenging for most.
Well, it depends how you want to look at it, though, Joseph. Right? Because if you first of all, the conflict between the Jewish population and the Arab population started even before World War II in the land. Right? It went on way before 48. But if we're looking at what one of your commenters said about empathy, we do have to look and be more empathetic to the Palestinians, in the sense that, okay, we're not equating it to the Holocaust, what happened in 48. We're not equating that to the Holocaust at all. They're two different things, oranges and apples. But we do understand, and my granddad fought in that war. He helped fund the country. He was here before 48. I can't take that back. What happened then? The past is the past. What happened back in 48? We can't go back and change that. What we have to look at doing now is saying it's 2021. We have this many Palestinians. We have this many Israelis. We have this much land. We need to make this work, because we have other issues. Believe me here, Joseph, overcrowd. We have so many environmental issues, poisoned rivers, so many issues aside from the war. So let's be more empathetic to each other. Okay, you guys suffered here, we suffered here, we both suffered. Let's stop suffering, and let's give our kids and the generations to come a better future. That's what I would say.
So maybe we move into that somewhere. So what is the path forward? Because you guys are all involved in peace work in your own way.
Good question. Very good question.
So yeah, let's explore that.
I mean, we have a lot of different opinions on what to do. I mean, I have a few ideas myself, like what I want and what I think are going to happen are two very different things. Essentially, my idea of what I think is going to happen is that Israel will end up annexing the West Bank. Gaza will at some point become like its own state unto itself. I just think that's the way it's going to happen if things keep progressing the way they are, keep stagnating. And the only thing I can hope for if that happens, that the annexation won't be unilateral. It will be negotiated with the PA or hopefully someone who takes over after Abu Mazen finally kicks the bucket. But that's the best case scenario I have in my head about where I think this is going. And honestly, I'm just kind of preparing myself and preparing my friends and my family for the reconciliation that will end up happening, I believe, within my lifetime after an annexation happens. I just hope the annexation is negotiated with the Palestinians as to what it would look like.
Does anyone have different thoughts?
Like having lived with the Palestinians and still living, coming from what we talked about, the obstacles, one of them being what I said, like, for example, education, I think is definitely a key factor, because when you kind of put a kind of an idea into a kid's mind, especially when he's young, like in first grade, second grade, growing up, it's gonna be super hard to change his identity, because at some point, he would not want to change his belief system. It just wouldn't, like, his ego would hurt him to kind of discover and what, us and the Israelis living together like that. That's almost like when Jesus used the example of Samaritan in the Good Samaritan, because he kind of, like, Samaritans and Jews used to be on a constant fight between each other, and then Jesus talks about a parable of like, hey, Samaritan helped the Jew, and then everywhere around the world now it's used as an example of if you love a stranger, if you help a stranger on the street, you're called a Good Samaritan. So maybe the solution is everyone having to be Good Samaritans. But like, jokes aside, I do see that it's definitely a big challenge. Settlements, and also I say settlements because we have a settlement near us and it's expanding. So soon they're going to be very close to us. So we might have to also coexist with them. We're still coexisting, but like, it's going to be close. They're very nice people, but also the Palestinians are also increasing and their villages are increasing. So at some point we're going to be closer to each other. And this might cause either us having to get along, or things might get complicated. So I'm just hoping for the best, and let's see. I think sitting face to face, both people, is a big factor. I saw it myself. When people sit together and talk together, they might fight at the beginning, but this is just going to be expressing their emotions. Their energy is going to be around, and it's just, in the end, it might just be easier for both to get along. That's maybe one thing that we can put on the table.
Do any of you believe in the two-state solution?
I sometimes do.
Yeah, sometimes. That's like the only way to describe it at this point.
Yeah.
Well, I would say one-state solutions is challenging, because what would that one state be? Like Israel? Palestine? Israel, because the Palestinians, I know how much they love their land, and the Israelis, I know how much they love their land, and both people are like, there's no way they're willing to kind of lose their name. I've been kind of criticized for saying the name Palestine, and also for saying the name Israel. Because why would you call it Palestine? There's no such thing that's called Palestine, I was said. And then the same thing, there's no such thing called Israel. You should call it the 1948. So you'd see the problem with the one-state solution.
The only
even
thing
if everyone gets the right.
the only thing that you could say, arguably, there are Palestinians in government in Israel today in the coalition. It doesn't. I mean, I think economics, power, all these things can shape someone's willingness to compromise on something as strong as their national identity, because that's happening within the pre-67 or however you want to call Israel today. It's happening there today.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's
a good point.
just generally part of like the whole pattern of what happens when you have populations intermingling. Like our Arab citizens in this country, feel way more Israeli than their brothers over the Green Line in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, as some of your commenters keep yelling at me for calling it West Bank. Arab Israelis have been a part of this country since the 48 war. And just the fact that they've been interacting with Israelis, interacting with Jews, like hearing our stories, being our neighbors, like they're what we could have in the West Bank if we had a type of settlement. Yeah, and I don't mean settlement as in buildings on the land. I mean like a deal between the two peoples, like as a way where we could give them their rights and we get our security. I do truly believe within a generation or two, you would have like West Bank Arabs be a lot more like the Arab Israelis of today, or Palestinian Israelis, as you want to see. Like, because at a certain point, people start looking at things pragmatically, and the nationalism and hatred sort of falls away. It can flare up, but it leads to the greatest thing that we need right now, which is exposure.
So are you all basically saying, just because I'm listening to what you're saying and trying to digest what it is you actually get, are you basically saying that the solution is going to be whether you want it or not, Israel is the more powerful party? Israel is likely to, at some point, annex or declare sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria for my viewers, the West Bank for your viewers, or Palestine for some of your viewers. Yeah. That's going to happen, and you're just hopeful for Israel to behave as a liberal democracy that applies equality, because that seems to be what's being played back, is that's going to be what's will happen. That seems to be what you're saying, unless I'm mishearing.
That's my hope, and I only speak for myself. Like everybody on this show has their own opinion.
I don't think that will happen at all. I don't think Israel is in a position to annex. It was something that has been talked about. Nobody had the balls to do it. So I don't think Israel is in a position to annex. But I do think I'm getting some feedback. That's annoying. Should be okay now.
Did someone disconnect their headphone?
We're all muted except you, Amir.
Okay, so I think that what will happen, hopefully, with a big capital H, is that there will be two sides that will want to come to an agreement. So at the moment, Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want to come to any agreement. Hamas don't want to come to any agreement. And to be quite honest, Israel doesn't want to come to any agreement. They're quite happy with the situation that is currently happening. So I think it's only going to happen when you have those two sides. And those two sides could come up with any type of deal. It could be a two-state, could be a one-state where it's two peoples in one state. It could be a confederation. It could be a federation. There's many ways to go when you're looking at a final settlement, final agreement, final peace deal. I'm open to whatever leads to peace on the land. If that's one state, if that's two state, if that's no state, I really, really am open to all ideas, but it has to be something that is realistic. Throwing people out of homes, I know some people, they want to give back land and kick people out of their homes. That is off the cards completely. And I think what Jared said is key. You know, intermingling between West Bank Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, I think that's going to be key to success in the long run, looking at peace going forward. And I do think that the West Bank and Jerusalem, of course, is key to solving this, because the Palestinians must understand that the Jewish homeland is not Tel Aviv, is not Ashdod, is not Haifa, but it is Shechem and Nablus, Shechem and Hebron, and Bet El, and Tirza, and this is like where the Jewish people kind of, you know, came from. This is the real heartland, and most Jews living there are not going to be, you know, willing to leave that land. So I think that the two-state classic paradigm needs to be chucked in the bin for now. We need to stop looking at things that were in the past potentially an option, and we need to look at something that can last for generations to come. So we had Rafi on our show, who, I don't know if you saw the episode, Joseph. He came up with a federation plan alongside a Palestinian friend of his. And it was a very, very well worked plan, way better than Trump's plan or any of the plans that you guys have seen. But I took issue with it for one simple reason. I don't want to be in a one-state solution where it can fragment off and sectarian violence can start, and certain areas will become unsafe, and you'll have like a Lebanon type situation and a big civil war. I will not, I don't want Israel to go down that route. But there are other options. There are confederations. There are other options. We don't have to be locked into one idea.
So just pick up on one thing, which I thought was quite interesting that you said, and it's a bit of a devil's advocate. I can make a lot of videos about this subject,
Sure.
but you said that no one's getting kicked out of their house.
Yeah.
And when you look at Sheikh Jarrah, when you look at Silwan, Kfar Shloach, Gan HaMelech, and then you look at Haifa, Jaffa, Lud, Ramla, you have different communities that have lost property, both Jewish and Arab, who believe they have a claim, should be compensated. It's of religious significance. So Gan HaMelech is one of my favorite ones. In 1967, when Jerusalem was unified or reunified, there was just below the city of David, David, just in the Holy Basin, there was a big green expanse. It was like a park, and it had been a park for centuries, and it's believed to have been King Solomon's garden. And for that reason, it had been preserved, and it is steeped in archaeology and history of religious importance. Under the Jordanian occupation, no properties were built there. 67, still no properties there. Then came the 80s, and an entire community literally sprung up. 80s and 90s, really in the 90s, an entire neighborhood was built on this, what was designated green space because of its historical importance. Now, I'm of the opinion that that particular community shouldn't exist on what is incredibly important, religiously significant Jewish land. It's a very, very relatively new neighborhood. Now, I think anyone living there should be compensated, and compensated well, and rehoused, because nobody wants to see anybody evicted. I also think the communities of Nachalat Shimon and Shimon HaTzadik, which Sheikh Jarrah, I think they have a right to those properties. And for my viewers, I'm going to say something controversial. I believe Palestinians or Arabs who were expelled, because there were some expulsions in the 48 war. I think most historians agree on that. The scale is probably where we'll disagree. But where people did lose their property, I believe they should be compensated as part of any final settlement. But when you say that nobody's going to lose their house, from a Jewish perspective, I'd have issue with that. And I know on the Palestinian side, there's going to be huge opposition to that type of expression. And now I don't think we should be creating refugees or anything like that, but blanket statements like nobody should lose any property or it becomes quite problematic given the sensitivity and the significance of the sites. As you mentioned, these are religiously significant for both communities.
But wait a minute, Joseph. Why is that even controversial? Not wanting to kick people out of their homes, that's controversial. I don't get it. Because okay, yeah, go on.
It happens in every country around the world. Evictions are part. So there's a difference between, say, take a community like Silwan. There's a difference between Silwan and say 500,000 Jews living in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. Because it's to do with degrees of scale, it's to do with the actual property in question, how long somebody's been living there. All these things factor into it, but I don't think there's many Palestinians that would give up, that will willingly or want to give up what they believe is a claim to property that they believe is rightfully theirs that they've lost, and they will pursue that. And that, I don't know how you square that circle. They will want.
I see. So you're looking at it more in the long term, how you can square that circle. I would say you can square it, man. You go back to how many Palestinian refugees there were. Go back to each village where they were, and each case as it is, it creates more work for Palestinian and Israeli lawyers. Fantastic. More money for everybody. I would say in terms of Silwan and areas within Jerusalem that are controversial, I'd say each case on its own. We don't need to kick anybody out of their homes that they're currently peacefully living in. That's just going to cause more long-term harm. We saw what happened when we kicked Jews out of Gush Katif and out of other settlements in Gaza. We saw the pain of soldiers doing things that they didn't ever think they'd be doing, kicking Jews out of their own land in the Holy Land. So I don't think that's any way to go. Places like Silwan, people have built there since 67, Joseph, and I know it's a beautiful area and city of David and the Kidron Valley and the Holy Basin. Those people are there now. Sure, if you could, wave a magic wand and say, okay, now you're in Ramallah, it's not going to happen. That these people are there now. I would suggest that the best thing is to try and build relations with all these people that live around the Jerusalem area. They're in a very tricky predicament anyway, not having, some have residency, some don't, some have this ID, some have that ID. They're in a very precarious situation. I'm more worried about, to be honest with you, as being someone from the South, I'm more worried about what's happening in the South. With the, my cousins, the Bedouin community, we recently had a Debon talking about the violence, talking about some of the issues down there. I'm way more worried about that than a few property disputes in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah that makes the news. I'm way more worried.
Isn't there huge property disputes isn't there also huge property disputes in the Negev with the Bedouin?
Iowa, and who's taking care of it? It's a problem that is just left to nobody. The government isn't doing anything with it. You have Bir Haddaj, a village that I used to volunteer in back in the day. I don't know if I'd be welcome there today. I might be scared to go there today. And that's me telling you the reality on the ground. Wild West, weapons everywhere, terror on the streets, literally. School teachers being shot at, Joseph, Bedouin school teachers that are trying to educate their kids for better by other clans are being shot at. These are the things happening in my country, and I want them solved. So, a little thing happening here in Jerusalem over Silwan, I'd rather go tackle some bigger issues, man. Go tackle the illegal arms that are all over this country. Go house to house and deal with the illegal arms. Because I know how many there are, and it is scary. It is actually scary to know the amount of illegal arms that are all over this place. You'd rather be in the Bahamas or something. I don't know, Bermuda.
Well, we have the settlement, not settlement. We have the refugee camp near us. Can you go to Joseph's viewpoint on the mountain? we rarely don't hear gunshots from there. I mean, it's pretty far from us, but we rarely don't hear any gunshots. And one day there was like some high school celebrations because like the grades were out, and like basically the Palestinians were celebrating their grades, high school grades. A big day, big day. So there's a lot of shooting that happened. And then one Samaritan woke up the next day and he saw his windshield, like car windshield, broken. Checked the cameras, nothing there, nothing, like just breaks. Then he went in, and it was actually a bullet that went all the way from the refugee camp. What goes up must go out down. So there is a lot of arms making. You're right. I mean, at least where I like in that refugee camp.
It's not just there, it's everywhere. It's all over the place, everywhere.
You say that, but I haven't seen all that much gun violence. Maybe it's a thing down in the south. I live up in the north. If any
I'm talking about refugee camp of Balata.
Oh,
so that's not Nablus. Nablus
camp
is pretty peaceful. I love.
I mean, those are refugee camps, but I was there. I'm just thinking of a joke now because my family in America and my friends have like the conception that Israel is extremely dangerous and there's just guns and bombs going off all the time. Since I've started living in Haifa, I don't think I've heard of a single fatal shooting or even heard a shooting anywhere near me. I went back to America recently, to my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. Gunshots every night.
That's crazy.
Every night. So I don't know. I just don't see this gun violence. Maybe it's just a thing that's more localized to the south in the Bedouin community.
I think you're in a bit of a bubble there in Haifa where you are, Jared. All over the north, in the upper, lower Galilee, in the some of the Arab towns, there's guns everywhere.
Oh yeah, like in places like Nazareth. Absolutely, but in Haifa everywhere. Cool.
I think it's something that's correlated with poverty and minority communities, because I know that in the U.S., gun violence is correlated with poverty. And I know that even in Israel proper, even among Israeli Arab communities, there tends to be more like internal like gun violence. And I think it's because, when people are poor, they start to turn to black markets and drugs and all that kind of stuff.
You're right,
and why
Anna,
isn't there an issue in Mesharim or Bnei Brak or any of the Haredi? I think it's a mixture of poverty, but also culture. I don't think it's just detached from culture. And otherwise, you would have the same issue in the Haredi community. And the Haredi community has its own issues, but gun violence isn't one of them.
Yeah. They just have regular violence.
And I think that's not okay. Let's say around poor, relatively secular people, because the Haredi community is another world, Yeah.
But isn't the poor Arab community majority religious Muslim and
not in a way that's comparable to Haredi communities where they literally don't have access to the internet? I don't think that's standard in any.
But no, that's just because that's the religious rules within that community. But they're still praying at the masjid 5 times a day. Their wives are likely to be. That's why you have, for instance, in the Bedouin community, you have low employment for Bedouin women because they're a religious community. That was I'm not there, so I may be massively off the mark.
No, with regards to the Bedouins, there is an issue there. But in recent years, there has been a lot of progression. We even have like a chief of, I don't know, not chief of police, but she's very high up in the police, a Bedouin officer, which is great. And we have a lot more participating in within the state. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. We shouldn't be arguing over, is it cultural? Is it this? Is it that? It doesn't matter. We have the fact of the matter is we have this many million citizens. There's this many illegal weapons in people's homes. What are the police doing to tackle it? That's what I want to know. That's where I'm at. As a citizen, I want to know that, bullets aren't going to come flying through the window, which, in places like Lud and Ramle, Joseph, can be common occurrence, unfortunately. I lived most of my time in Israel in a kibbutz called Kibbutz Shoval. It's opposite Rahat. And like Aboud said, with Balata, I would hear gunshots pretty much on a nightly basis, I would say. Now, I would say with the years, as I've gotten older, the situation definitely has got better over the last, let's say, 15 years. But it's something that we can't let our finger off the buzzer with. We have to be on top of it, because the slide towards carnage, like we saw during the recent violence, it was drastic. There were suddenly lynchings on the street, Jewish lynchings, Arab lynchings, rockets flying everywhere. It went down. Because of the technology and media, it almost supercharged it. That's how I felt anyway. I felt like this conflict was supercharged compared to the other ones 12, 13 years ago.
So I'd agree with that. And that was one of so just building on everything that everyone's just said, but building on that, one of the things that I'm less hopeful about was what happened in the latest flare-up, and was the civil unrest between Arabs and Jews that were both Israeli. And so you've painted a picture where you've got a community which is armed in the south. There's illegal weapons in the south, there's illegal weapons in the north, there's illegal weapons in the camp, and let's make a distinction between Palestinians that are living in the camps and Palestinians that are living in the cities, and because there is a big difference. But you've got all these communities that are armed, that aren't getting along, and it begs the question, as people who are making peace in the Holy Land, how do you bring this? I mean, the picture you've painted is even bleaker than when we started, because you've got all the historical conflict. You've got the Arab world, the Muslim world looking in on the conflict. And then you've thrown in actually internally, even within Israel, it's not in a great place. And so where do we go? How do we overcome? Because it's clearly not just Israelis, Palestinians. It's now what you're saying is there's Israeli Arabs, Israeli Bedouin, Israeli Jews. There's so many divisions.
Let's see, Joseph, like from the Samaritan community, we have Palestinian IDs, Israeli IDs, I even have Jordanian IDs. Why are we getting along with both nations? Even though we can openly be, they openly know we have Israeli IDs, but why are we getting along with both nations, right? What would be your guess? Because I think this is the reason, because I don't know the 100% the answer, but if I had to guess, we lived in Nablus with the Palestinians for well over, I think, 500 years. And we might have faced some kind of racism one way or another, but throughout the years, we also learned to live with them peacefully and just be part of what they do. And just, we kind of intermingled with them. That kind of probably is one step. But also having roots to the Israeli, like same roots, I think, with the Jewish people. Maybe that's why. So I think just like having connections with both people, just living with them, maybe made it easier. Could
it also be because the Samaritans are so small, they're not a threat to either population?
That's also,
and both populations have respect for the Samaritans, for your longevity, for your survival. I think both Muslims, Jews respect religious communities, particularly.
That's actually a very good point. We were invited once by Hamas, actually. I think it was 10 years ago. We were invited by Hamas. When I say we, I mean the Samaritan Council. That's basically kind of represents the Samaritan community. And we were kind of shocked at how well they received us. But then again, we're a minority. We're not a threat to them, like I said. So, yeah.
I have a question, Aboud. I'm wondering if going back to Joseph's original thesis, which I think has a lot of truth to it, which is that this conflict comes down a lot to religion. Your religion is one of the only ones in the Holy Land that doesn't see Jerusalem as the holiest place. True. And so maybe that's part of why you guys get along with everyone, is not necessarily because because at the end of
Well,
the
you're
day,
right. Mount Gerizim is pretty quiet.
you know.
So
I mean,
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of
yeah.
the things that
Good point.
always blows my mind is when you see the riots breaking out in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre amongst the like most religious devout Christians in the world, and they're like clashing.
You could set the heart of Christendom on fire by moving a ladder.
Yeah.
And I will never not find that funny. Like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, like I don't know, it's just the fact that like there are so many overlapping agreements in order to control this one place, which is probably why the Samaritans get away with, just being fine over there with everyone else. We're all fighting over this clump of dirt. Meanwhile, they're just sitting over there huddled around there, is just like, yeah, good.
Mount Gerizim is holy for the Jews
one.
in terms that there is a verse that says, "You shall put the blessings on Mount Gerizim, and the cursings on Mount Ebal." Although some people will argue that maybe like when they pronounced like 6 of the tribe or 6 people representing each tribe were said on Mount Gerizim and 6 on Mount Ebal. Each of them putting the blessings, but putting the cursings. But I do believe, that like in terms of that, it is holy for the Jews too. Not as holy as Jerusalem, maybe, but
Joseph, I just want to. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to address something Joseph said, because we did get a bit negative with the violence and things going on here. So I do want to put a tiny positive spin just before your point, Anna, because the amount of guns, illegal guns that are out there, a lot of it is crime related. A lot of these things that we're talking about are crime related. Like any other country, we have unfortunately mobs and crime families and these kind of things that do go on. So my thing as an Israeli is I want more, the police to do more and our authorities to do more to stamp out the crime and the violence. And in general, guys, Israel is a very safe place. And usually, I mean, I've lived in London for many, many years as well, and I've seen more violence on the street of London than I have in Israel, to be perfectly honest. But that's just my life experience.
Right.
So go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, so we have one question, and he just kept on asking it. He asked a couple of times, so I'm going to share it again. Great show. I enjoy listening to you guys. There's something I'm researching. It's the similarities between the charges against Israel today and the Soviet slanders against Israel in the Cold War era. Are you familiar with that?
Vaguely. By the charges against Israel today, I assume he's talking about like just the widespread accusations made against Israel, as well as things I've voted for by the UN. And I know a bit about Soviet communism, which is a very unique and weird form of communism. And basically the way the Soviet Communist Party thought about Zionism, there is a lot of overlap in like their propaganda against Zionism, as well as the sort of charges that you see against Israel. I assume that's what he's talking about, especially with the idea that Jews don't need a home, which is basically the core of the communist argument against Zionism, is that nationality shouldn't matter at all. It's all about class, and states shouldn't exist anyway. That's what communism is that everything should be run by class, by people who live in their community and work together. Like there should be no state at all. That's the core of the communist idea. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the propaganda that the Soviets made about Israel got picked up very quickly by Arab governments. And they spread and they stayed that way ever since. And now the Soviet Union's gone, the propaganda's still there.
Yep. Mine is definitely not my area, but my understanding is that the Soviets actively pushed anti-Semitic propaganda to the Arab states, places like Egypt. And Abu Mazen uses that as his justification or excuse for why he wrote his thesis on Holocaust denial, was that he was susceptible to Soviet anti-Semitic propaganda. But this is not my field of expertise, so I'm going to leave it to others.
No, but you're right, Joseph. You're right. And I do believe he studied over there as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I'm
Well, I mean that's just a known fact. A lot of the PLO leadership was in some form of contact with, the Soviet authorities. Like that was just part of like the whole Cold War game. Like the USSR sided with Egypt because they wanted better control over the Suez. It's helped play their geopolitical game. So the US had to counter that. So who does the US support? Well, what's the country that's not friendly with Egypt on Egypt's border? It's us. So obviously that means we're enemies of the Soviet Union. So who's the KGB going to start helping clandestinely? Well, they're organizations who don't want Israel to exist. Israel, who is friendly with the United States. Organizations like the PLO. That's how they got their AKs.
But on the flip side, the Soviets played both sides because in the 48 war, they were responsible for all the weapons. We would have, when we went into the 48 war, we were massively outgunned, massively outnumbered, and we were able to acquire arms, light planes, from the Soviet states or via Soviet
Czechoslovakia specifically.
Exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, that's because when the 48 war was just starting out, Stalin assumed Israel would be in the Soviet sphere of influence, considering, Israel was basically being led by, labor Zionism, like leftist socialist parties. Like that's who ran the country until Menachem Begin. So like the Soviet leadership just kind of assumed Israel would be within, their ally, because like people forget this, but when Israel became a country, who Israel sided with, whether it was first, second, or third world, was not set in stone. Israel very easily could have been a Soviet ally, and we could still be hostile to America to this day. But we went in the other direction when the Soviets changed their strategy, because they saw more benefit in having closer relations to the Arab states than in Israel. And that kind of just pushed us in the direction of the US. I mean, hell, during the Korean War, there were like debates in the Knesset about whether or not Israel should support North Korea in the war. That's how close we got to being a communist ally.
One of the things I like.
Oh, you muted yourself, Justin.
There you go. Sorry, amateur. One of the things that I find really interesting is how the British and the Soviets both played both sides. So you had the British promising everything to the Arabs and to the Jews, and the actual British actually got along with the Arabs way more than they got along with the Jews, because the Jews all spoke Russian. They saw them as Bolsheviks, whereas the British were imperialists. But the Zionists had much greater influence in London than the Arabs did. So they were playing both sides continuously through the Mandate period. And then the Soviets were the same. The Soviets were playing both the Jews and the Arabs, and you have these global powers just playing us off against each other. And to a degree, that's still happening to this day. Most nations have their own vested interests in the conflict, and that's one of the other huge obstacles to peace is the foreign policies of other nations, which I don't know how you overcome.
They should stick their nose out. They should stick their nose out of people's business and let Israelis and Palestinians figure it out by themselves. Because all these Trump plan, this plan, that plan, this plan, all nonsense.
It's different when you're here, right?
Yeah, it's all nonsense. The Trump plan, I couldn't believe that people actually thought it was going to happen. It was a wedding without a bride, It was, here's your deal. Here's your deal.
It was a wedding without a bride, dress, cake, venue. It was just the card that said "save the date." That's all it was.
So the plan might not have been that good, but he was influential in creating more peace between Israel and Arab states than previous American presidents have been. Which the plan, I agree, was destined to fail, but ball that started rolling from the Trump camp actually
fantastic, and that needs to be commended, because the Abraham Accords are something that needs to be built on now. It's fantastic, guys. I've seen the Abraham Accords come while I'm living here, and now see them in fruition. It's only brought amazing things to the whole region, and this is what we need to be building on now. And definitely looking at Abraham or Avraham or Avram or Ibrahim,
twice.
Ibrahim, however
Avi.
you want, or Avi, however you want to call him,
Gotta
he's
put
the
that in.
father figure that can unite Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So I think we definitely need to look more towards this figure. And in terms of
What
a name,
about Abdallah Cohen? I could be like the president for both Palestinians and Israelis. You know, I would be a Cohen and I will be an Abdallah.
Voila, I will
You got
vote for
my
you.
vote.
Yeah, we
I'll
all just
vote for you.
unite around a mood.
I'm quite happy for you to be
Solution
my
right
Cohen
here.
Gadol.
You heard it first.
Cohen Gadol?
This is how it's going to
Yeah,
be
I'm quite
solved.
happy for you to be my Cohen Gadol.
Yeah.
Well, I am in line, maybe in 40, 50 years. So
So what I do, because we've been going for an hour and a half now, what I'd like you each to end on is what your ideal state looks like. Like, what would the ideal, not what's possible, what Israel's going to do, but what would the ideal look like for each of you?
cool question.
Ideal. God, you want this to go on for another 3
Utopia.
hours?
No, I really like this question. Like right off the bat, if I imagine an ideal state where like really both people understand each other very well, having the same rights, or not really the same rights, but the suitable rights for them, and having like the ability to use their potential, because I've lived with the Palestinians and I think that their potential to, for example, in technology is really I think is underrated. So I really wish, I think also having Palestinians and Israelis build startup projects and high-tech projects, that would be amazing to see. I think that would be an ideal thing to see. Maybe salaries, maybe even tourism being done, Palestinians in Israel and in Palestinian cities, and it's just like kind of ease of travel for both people. I mean, sounds unrealistic for some people. Like, oh, what, Palestinians not having a checkpoint, something like that. I have a Palestinian friend who went like in their aid, just freely to the beach. I mean, not freely, he just found a way in. I don't know how, but he even slept on the beach there. He loved it. But still, he might get paranoia by just being caught. So maybe by removing that paranoia. I had a friend who never saw the sea in her life, and for the first time ever, she did in Haifa. So maybe they should have easier access. You know, I can go on, but like these are the things that can go on. Cool question, though. I like it.
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially what I want, but I guess in the idea of the state, I can go into a bit detail. I want basically more power to the mechozot. I want to like elect a local governor for my area. I feel like that would help a lot to ease tensions across the country, because then we all wouldn't have to be governed from Jerusalem. We could have our own local representative to do things in our area. Basically, I would want that. Add everything Aboud said about equal rights. I do kind of like the idea of a one state at this point. And that's mainly because of my, selfish ego, knowing that, like, without Gaza, if Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be Israel. We have the numbers to have it like still be a 66% Jewish majority state. And that's my selfish ego thinking like, yeah, that's pretty good. So I want that federalized system, more power to the mechozot. We can have our own local governors. Maybe that can also help alleviate some of the tensions with Palestinians. And if they want to continue calling themselves Palestinians, that's glorious. The Quebecois in Canada still call themselves Quebecois, even though they're Canadian. We can have something similar here. That's kind of my ideal.
Gibraltar. Never heard about that island.
Oh, Gibraltar? You haven't heard of it?
Beautiful.
Oh, okay. Now that you said it, now it sounds more familiar. I just pronounced it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think my ideal, it switches back and forth, but I think for me, the main things are, I agree with you. My ideal world, people apologize for the suffering that they've caused on both sides. Like if you did something, if you know, like I think that Israeli government needs to compensate the people who lost their homes in 48. And I think that the Arab governments need to compensate people like my family who lost their homes in the Arab world. And I want to see Palestinians have equal rights and freedom of movement. Personally, on a practical level, just because now I have Palestinian friends, a one state sounds nicer to me because it's just like less hassle trying to get all your friends together. And it's like, honestly, like on a personal level, when you have like a good friend who like, you know, is safe, and it's like, but they can't get in to see Tel Aviv and hang out with you for a day. It's like, you know, it just feels stupid. But I think I could see a two-state solution too. I think it depends. Like, I'm okay with whatever, as long as everyone has a passport, has people who have been wronged. People have been wronged on the Jewish side. People have been wronged on the Palestinian side. Feel that they've been compensated and feel that, you know, their pain is heard, and we can just move forward and live our lives. We're all going to be living here, Palestinians and Jews. We're going to be living in this land, so we got to figure that out.
Yeah.
Definitely. All great points so far. I'm so proud of the Open Peace team right here, because they're coming up with some gems. But yeah, you know, definitely all of what's been said so far. I would just add to that. I would love to see an eco-friendly and clean Holy Land, and that means Palestinian areas, Israeli areas, whatever you want to call it, because we have some environmental problems and we have issues with recycling and trash and that kind of stuff, and we have, you know, a beautiful land. Both peoples love it.
Green makes people calmer. So
yeah, definitely.
Wink, wink.
Definitely.
How can you be mad at a forest? Those are just calming features.
Well, I can get mad at a forest because sometimes I go to an Israeli forest and there's rubbish everywhere. So then I get angry, but it's not at the forest. It's at the people.
I was about to say, because that's not the forest's fault.
Yeah, it's not the forest's fault. It's the people leaving the stuff there. And, you know, in terms of education, we've been talking about it the whole podcast. This kind of stuff comes down to education. Same with litter in the streams, rivers, lakes, etc. We definitely need to do more to look after our environment. I know that in Gaza, the situation is very, very dire in terms of open sewage and stuff like that. These are all things that need to be taken care of. And I just want to leave the podcast on a little note, because we do actually have a friend of ours, Rudy, who is currently detained along with two others. I can't exactly remember their name, but there's a hashtag going out, Free the Three, I think, to try and get them out. They're detained currently in Nigeria. We're obviously wishing them all the safety and all the best, and hopefully they can get themselves home as fast as possible. And a speedy recovery to your friend who was attacked in the park, Joseph. It's really sad to hear that. Very, very sad.
So, yeah, I think the thing with Rudy is that the family don't want too much of a noise made just yet, because they're trying to exhaust all the diplomatic channels first, which is why there hasn't been as much noise from most of the big organizations yet. But, yeah, hopefully the three of them will be released soon. I think I'd just like to add one thing, because I usually don't answer my own questions, but having listened to Aboud's personal story, I don't really know. I'm terrible at visualizing utopia, but it's something that Amir has been saying constantly. I think one of the keys for building meaningful peace and meaningful relationships between our two communities is shared education. I don't want my Jewish children to necessarily be doing Islamic studies at Nablus, at a school in Nablus, but I do think shared schools for Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, instead of quite segregated communities, I think is the real key not even just the key to peace, but when you're there, it shows that you actually have a community and you are living together. You're not living side by side. Guys, I really want to thank you for coming on the channel. Whenever I speak to you, I learn a lot. I've learned a lot today, Anna. It's been fantastic meeting you for the first time.
Nice to meet you.
That's right. It is the first. You weren't here when we was on.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you all. The links are all in the comments below. But do you want to just shout out your Twitter handles?
Things coming up
so that they can recommend. So do you want to shout out where they can find you all?
Find us. You can find our YouTube channel. Just type in Open Peace Podcast.
You could also find us on the Twitter at Open Peace Pod, without the cast, at Open Peace Pod, and find us on Instagram at Open Peace Podcast. And if you like tahini, search for Tahini Har Bracha. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I appreciate your time.
This episode was brought to you by Tahini Har Bracha.
I hate all of you. I hate all of you so much. Goodbye.